Well, Ramses and Paul, we're so excited to have you on the podcast. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here, both of you.
Thank you for having us. Sorry, I'm speaking for Paul.
Yeah, my pleasure. Ramesus can always speak for me.
We're so glad to have you both. We have this Come Follow Me lesson coming up, and it's not on a Sunday school lesson week, but it feels like such an important topic. And so we want to offer this early so that as people are sort of looking ahead in Come Follow Me and maybe they have some influence in their ward, that this can be something that we incorporate into a lesson that we can talk about as a community. And so we're really grateful for both of your perspectives here. And I thought maybe, Paul, we could start with you. And considering that we're kind of talking about the priesthood temple ban in the context of a Come Follow Me lesson, I would be really interested to just hear how you would frame this in a church setting, because we've had a lot of conversations about the priesthood temple ban itself and about the history of the ban, but I think it's really hard to talk about together. And so I'd love for you to just start with, like, what is your even, like, if you were actually teaching this in class or you were a participant in the class, how do you frame the way we grapple with this together as a church community now?
Yeah, sure. I think, first of all, having open and honest discussions about church history is an important framing point. So, Elder Stephen Snow, when he was church historian, said, I'm paraphrasing, but we accomplish a lot more. It does more good than harm to talk about and be open and honest about our past than it does to cover it up. And so that's a framing philosophy. Uh, President Oakes has called on us as Latter-day Saints to do better at rooting out racism. How do you root it out if you're unwilling to examine its roots? And I think President Nelson admonished Latter-day Saints to lead out in abandoning attitudes and actions of prejudice. So those are framing devices. But historically, the way that I would frame a conversation about the racial restrictions would just simply lay it out in three phases for people. And my experience has been people understand these three phases. There are all kinds of light bulbs that go on in their heads. And it actually, I've had people say, it kind of lifts burdens. So first couple of decades, open priesthood and temples, there were no racial restrictions. The Joseph Smith Papers Project is now over. The team of, 10, 15 PhD trained historians, not a single one of them came up with any evidence that the racial restrictions are traceable to Joseph Smith. And in fact, the exact opposite, evidence of an open racial vision, inclusive in universalism, bound up in the message of the Restoration, 5 revelations, stipulating that the gospel is to be preached unto every creature that Joseph Smith claims. So phase 1, open priesthood and temples. Phase 2, segregated priesthood and temples, but that develops in fits and starts across the course of the 19th century. I think firmly solidified in place in the 1908, early decades of the 20th century. And then June of 1978, is simply a return to the original universalism. It's not taking the faith in a new direction, but actually restoring the faith to its founding scriptures, restoring the faith to the principles of the Restoration. So for me, simply those 3 phases as a framing device is the best way to understand the restrictions. And if people understand that 1978 is actually a recovery of the original universalism, I think it can help people to understand this history a lot more clearly. When Deseret Book asked me to write, let's talk about race and priesthood, the early conversations were, okay, if we're doing this, it's structured around those 3 phases. And those are the 3 parts that set up the book. So that's the best way, I think, to understand it.
Yeah. The lesson itself says, we don't know why priesthood ordination and temple ordinances were not available to church members of African descent for a time. And I think you argue that the historical record actually gives us, quite a bit of clarity. I'd be curious to hear you talk about that, especially because I think what a lot of times this material is trying to do is continue to allow people to get around the uncomfortable idea that this was not instituted by God, and that it may in fact be instituted by fallible men, even if these men in many ways were great leaders or great prophets. So I'd be curious to hear you talk about that concept. And Ramses, feel free to add your thoughts here as well.
Yeah, I'm frustrated with we don't know because there is so much that we do know. And, even within the last 10 years, new evidence has come to light that firmly grounds the beginnings of the racial restrictions. And a debate between Brigham Young and Orson Pratt. We have a prophet, leader of the faith, who is also territorial governor, in a debate with an apostle who is also a territorial legislator. And they are going head to head over racial enslavement in 19th century Utah territory. But that political debate bleeds really quickly into a theological debate over the status of people of Black African ancestry in the faith. And all of that is new information that prior scholars did not have access to until 2013, when Lejeune Caruth transcribed speeches that had been collected in 1852 and sat in George Watt's collection, recorded in Pitman shorthand and not transcribed.
Did you say 2013?
Right.
This is brand new. Like this is really new information.
I wish people understood that, I really wish people understood that there's a flood of new evidence that has come to light in the last decade. So, when I was doing research for a religion of different color, my research questions, I'm not going to go into the weeds and sort of the details of how the thought played out, but those research questions led to the uncovering of this folder in George Watt's collection in the Territorial Legislative Recorder. His typical process would be to record in Pitman shorthand and then transcribe his own shorthand into longhand. And that's how things would be published in the Deseret News and in the Journal of Discourses. This collection was never transcribed. And so it sat in his folder, right, until 2013. And so that's one important source of new information. And so for the church for the Come Follow Me curriculum, let me say, to say we don't know without giving any additional kind of information or evidence, we have a very strident 5th of February, 1852 speech by Brigham Young, where he very firmly claims to know. And so it's just blatantly ignoring evidence. And then we have a new speech that was uncovered from 1856, even more recently than 2013. This is in the last couple of years. Another strident anti-slavery speech by Orson Pratt, where he says that we have no proof that Black people are descendants of Cain. And that's Brigham Young's only rationale for a racial priesthood restriction. The only reason he ever gives is the curse of Cain links to the story in the Bible of Cain's murder of Abel. So what I want is for people to read these speeches for themselves then, right? If the claim is we don't know, well, people in these speeches are claiming to know. And there's a lot of new evidence, a lot of new information. It's all contained in Let's Talk About Race and Priesthood. That evidence is there. When Deseret Book approached me to write it, I said, your full editorial board has to read Brigham Young's 5th of February 1852 speech, the Pitman shorthand version. I will be quoting from it. That's the evidence that we're dealing with, right?
So can I ask you a little bit more, like what was going on exactly in 1852 that really brought this to a head? Like what were the conversations that were happening that meant that they were trying to explain this? It just seemed like there's a lot of commotion all of a sudden in 1852 and 53. So why were they talking about it and arguing, and like what's happening culturally?
Yeah, great questions, Ivory. I don't know if people are aware, there are Black enslaved Latter-day Saints who arrive in the Salt Lake Valley on July 22nd, 1847, 2 days ahead of Brigham Young. They're a part of Orson Pratt's vanguard group. So 3 Black enslaved men arrive 2 days ahead of Brigham Young, and they're already plowing and planting by the time Brigham Young arrives on July 24th, 1847. So enslavement arrives with the Latter-day Saints, and then Native American enslavement predates the arrival of Latter-day Saints into the Salt Lake Valley. And so those 2 forms of enslavement are a part of what the Latter-day Saints encounter. You have white Latter-day Saints bringing enslaved people with them as they gather to the Salt Lake Valley. Some of those Black enslaved people are also Latter-day Saints. So white enslavers enslaving their fellow Latter-day Saints. By 1852, the territorial legislature is grappling with what laws should govern the legal relationship between white enslavers and the Black enslaved, as well as between white Latter-day Saints who have purchased Native American children and women from Ute traffickers. And so in 1852, it's an all Latter-day Saint territorial legislature. They are debating those 2 bills, other bills as well.
Wow.
Who should be able to vote in Utah Territory. And Orson Pratt is proposing that Black men be allowed to vote in Utah Territory in 1852. And the Native American Indigenous Bill and the Black Servant Code are the topics that produce this mix of politics, theology, religion, and Brigham Young will first openly and publicly articulate a race-based priesthood restriction in the middle of this debate with Orson Pratt over Black slavery in Utah Territory. The racial restrictions predate the legislative session, but all kinds of evidence that the public articulation is coming in this legislative session, and then Latter-day Saints start to speak about openly after 1852. So Brigham Young, in a private meeting in 1849, is articulating a rationale grounded in Cain's murder of Abel, but that's a private meeting. By 1852, he's publicly articulating in the context of this debate over Black slavery in Utah Territory.
Okay.
So that's what's going on, Aubrey, that produces all of these speeches. And like I said, an entire debate over the Native American Indigenous Bill, a debate over who should be allowed to vote in Utah Territory, and a debate over the status of Black people in the faith itself that bleeds into, the political debate bleeds into this theological debate. Orson Pratt is defining people of Black African ancestry as inherently innocent. Brigham Young is defining them as inherently guilty. It's a violation of the second article of faith. Joseph Smith says we're accountable for our own sins, not for Adam's transgression. And yet Brigham Young holds an entire group of people who he supposes to be descendants of Cain accountable for a murder in which they take no part. And Orson Pratt calls them innocent and will later say they're not, in fact, descendants of Cain. And hopefully it goes without saying, in 2025, Orson Pratt was right. But what the long-term implications of this debate is that we have a priesthood and temple restriction that stretched for 130 years, and we're still grappling with it in 2025, claiming we don't know where it comes from.
Yeah. I'm really curious, Ramesus, on the personal side, if you put yourself into the Sunday school classroom, for instance, and you heard this being taught or commented on, and the line is that we don't know why this ban was put in place. And I think, again, the implication is that it was God's doing. What's going through your mind when you hear that?
It's funny. I host a dinner group. So we call it a fancy book club because we have dinner first and then we discuss Paul's book, Race. Let's talk about Race in the Priesthood. And a couple of Fridays ago, this came up. One of the ladies in the class was like, it's very frustrating that they keep saying we don't know. And they asked my opinion. I was like, I I echo the sentiment of being frustrated, because when you go through the evidence that Paul lays out for us, and not just in Let's Talk About Race and the Priesthood, but actually his first book, Religion of a Different Color, he does such a thorough explanation of how the church was inclusive. And then from persecution from white culture, the church shifts and becomes exclusive, and then gradually is moving back. So for me, because it's a hard topic, I would bring up the historical aspect, because that's what we know. What we do know is that in the 1840s, Brigham was talking about Q. Walker Lewis, how he was one of the best, greatest elders who happened to be a black man in the church. You have Elijah Abel, who falls in that same category. And then it's like, oh, they're marrying white women. And at that point in time, it was the theory of amalgamation, that if you had a child with a black man, that your womb would become barren and all these crazy things. And I had made the comment, it's a funny concept when you consider that white enslavers were taking advantage of black enslaved women and having babies, which is how we get fair-skinned black people in the United States. That is a hard thing for people to reconcile. I mean, we're all human and we're all fallible. And I look at it as that Brigham allowed his personal feelings to cloud his judgment. I'm not making excuses for Brigham. That's how I feel. It's something that has come to me in the temple, that we all sin. And in order to heal, we have to be willing to give grace to those who may have done something or said something out of emotion. That's how I will address it. And it's not an excuse to say, well, that was the time in 1852, everybody was racist, because in 1852, everybody wasn't racist. South of the Mason-Dixon line, they were racist, but even in that context, some of them weren't. Some of them did see black people as equals, but to use that as the catch-all be-all to say that that's why he did it, it's bigger than him being racist. It's more about the Lord told you specifically through Joseph Smith that the gospel was for everyone, that he is not a respecter of persons. So if that's the case, you do not withhold the priesthood from black people. And I made this comment in my class. We have leaders that talk about rooting out racism, but what does racism really look like? And Paul and I have had this discussion about, till the church acknowledges the past and apologizes for the damage that has happened, the church is not going to ever be able to repent and move forward, because you have people, even to today, who still believe that the priesthood restriction and temple ban was of God.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. It feels like there's something healing about just telling the whole truth, all the truth we have. And I know in myself that there's a resistance to like wanting to talk about uncomfortable things. And this is at the very top of the list. So I understand it feels like a relief to just say, well, we really don't know, but let's move on and let's talk about what we're doing well now. And so it's really, really helpful, Ramesus, to understand and think more about why step one is just having clear eyes and having the courage to look at what's completely true. And so I'm grateful to both of you for just sort of opening that up. And I want to just ask you one more history question before we talk more about the lived experience that this era is still having on the lives of Latter-day Saints now. But could you just talk about what happened? Like, what happened to the people who did have the priesthood? And was anyone going to the temple before 1852? What happened to Elijah Abel's priesthood? What happened to Q. Walker Lewis? Like, was it taken? When did it become an official policy that no one knew could be ordained?
Yeah, so it is not set in stone at Brigham Young's first utterance, is one thing I hope people become aware of. So when I say phase two, segregated priesthood and temples, that phase drags on across the course of the last half of the 19th century
Wow.
and not solidified in place until the beginning decade of the 20th century. And you see these moments, right, where we have historical evidence that shows Latter-day Saint leaders grappling with what to do about the Black priesthood holders that continue to exist and complicate, the story of whiteness. So you mentioned Elijah Abel and Q. Walker Lewis. So they're the two most well-documented Black priesthood holders in the 19th century in terms of people who are unambiguously understood to be Black in the 19th century and unambiguously understood to be priesthood holders. Just uncontrovertible evidence for both of these men. And like Ramesus said, Brigham Young is on record in March of 1847 as favorably aware of Q. Walker Lewis as a Black priesthood holder. And I think I agree with Ramesus, right? It's Brigham Young's concern over race mixing that leads him to start moving in a different direction between 1847 and 1852. So what happens to the Black priesthood holders? Elijah Abel dies a Black priesthood holder in
Really?
1884. He appeals in 1879 to be sealed to Mary Ann, who's a Black Latter-day Saint pioneer. They immigrate as a family in a overland wagon train from Cincinnati to Utah in 1853. They're rebaptized after their arrival, which was typical for immigrant trains. They are rebaptized again in 1857 as a part of the Mormon Reformation. So, 3 baptisms for both of them. I'm trying to say, like, dare to challenge their devotion to this faith, right? Because the evidence is that they are profoundly devoted. Mary Ann dies in 1877 of pneumonia, and there's belated remembrances that suggest that Elijah Abel appeals to Brigham Young to receive his sealing to Mary Ann. If so, that escapes the written record, but in 1879, what does enter the written record is his appeal to John Taylor. Elijah Abel, importantly, received his washing and anointing rituals in the Kirtland Temple in 1836. That is substantiated by evidence and records at the Church History Library. So once again, to say we don't know all kinds of records, like Latter-day Saints are amongst the best record-keeping people on the planet, and to suggest that there is no evidence that sort of traces through the mists of time back into the eternities is leaves me frustrated. So I'll just try to simply answer your question, Aubrey. Elijah Abel is told no by John Taylor, but John Taylor conducts an investigation. So if the racial restrictions are in place unambiguously, why would the leader of the faith need to conduct an investigation in 1879? He could have just said, no, you're barred from the priesthood.
Yeah.
Leave it alone, right? But he interviews a variety of people. They enter Elijah Abel's patriarchal blessing into the record. He's given his patriarchal blessing by Joseph Smith Sr., and he tells Joseph F. Smith, who is sent to interview him, that Joseph Smith told him he had the right to the priesthood and all of its blessings. That's in the notes of Joseph F. Smith's handwriting, verified by the Church History Department as Joseph F. Smith's handwriting, right? Once again, we know so much. There's so many written records. He's denied temple admission, but allowed to retain his priesthood. John Taylor's conclusion is, well, in the early days of the church, sometimes the leaders made mistakes. So however you factor this, someone had to make a mistake. Either Joseph Smith made a mistake, according to John Taylor, in giving Black people the priesthood, or Brigham Young made a mistake of denying Black people the priesthood. And that's John Taylor's own conclusion. Well, in the early days of the church, there were mistakes made. Brigham Young said it right. We will allow Elijah Abel's priesthood to stand, but we're not going to ordain more Black people to their priesthood, and we're not going to let him in the temple. But by 1883, we will call him on a third mission for the faith. He's a member of the Third Quorum of the 70, and they send him back to Ohio as a missionary at age 75. He returns back to Ohio, serves a mission, comes back to Salt Lake, dies within 2 weeks of his return on Christmas Day in 1884. And his obituary is published in the Deseret News. It's not a typical eulogy. He's described, it basically recites his priesthood ordination dates. I don't know who wrote it. I suspect it's his daughter. That's my personal inclination. And she recites his priesthood ordination dates and say he died within 2 weeks of his return, died in full faith of the gospel. Q. Walker Lewis is in Salt Lake in 1852 when this debate in Utah Territory takes place. You know, the records aren't public. I don't know how much he's aware. He's an abolitionist. So if he finds out, you know, and I think he easily could have found out after the legislative session is over, that they decide to enact a form of unfree labor in Utah Territory, I think that would have been really upsetting to him. We're not really sure what happens. He returns to Massachusetts, reopens his barbershop, and then dies a couple of years later. And his wife has him buried in an Episcopal cemetery, which is the faith she belongs to. So it doesn't necessarily mean he was no longer a Latter-day Saint, right? It's just not clear. We don't have firm evidence one way or the other. So those are two of the most well-documented Black Latter-day Saints. Just to kind of bring it to the beginning of the 20th century, why I say the racial restrictions are solidified in place under Joseph F. Smith in 1908, because we see Joseph F. Smith's memory deteriorates, however you want to phrase it. 1879, he verifies Elijah Abel as a Black priesthood holder. 1895, right? You see Latter-day Saints responding to these questions time and time again, and each generation unwilling to violate the precedent of the prior generation. So each succeeding generation saying, no, I remember, you know, Brigham Young said this, and we can't violate what he said. And some falsely remembering back, I remember Joseph Smith said this. And in 1908, in response to another query about Black priesthood ordination, Joseph F. Smith, in 1895, he will remind Latter-day Saint leaders, hey, we had Elijah Abel. He was a faithful Black priesthood holder, and speak in favor of Elijah Abel and speak more out of this sense of universalism. 1904, he starts moving in a different direction. He claims Abel's priesthood was a mistake that was never corrected. 1908, he says it was his priesthood had been declared null and void by the prophet himself. And so in that moment, he is basically creating a new narrative for the faith moving forward, suggesting that the racial restrictions are in place from the beginning. God put them in place. Human beings had nothing to do with it. And that becomes the new memory in the 20th century. And Latter-day Saint leaders believe it. Everyone believes it. No one is going back and doing the research. We've erased from collective Latter-day Saint memory the Black Latter-day Saint pioneers who complicate the story of whiteness. That's Latter-day Saints' passage into whiteness is in 1908. And the memory becomes priesthood has always been white, temples have always been white, and human beings can't do anything about it. It'll take a revelation to get rid of, and in fact, it does 70 years later. So that's kind of the complicated, messy story that's laid out. And let's talk about race and priesthood so that people can dig into it themselves. But those are the bits of evidence that are important to consider. Once again, if you're going to claim we don't know, then you have to grapple with all of the things we do know.
Yeah. I think, yeah, what's so tricky about the, complicated and messy story is that when you hear all of that, it sounds very mundane. It sounds very, in the sense that it's just very human, Yeah. Another piece of this Sunday school lesson, one of the little questions that it asks is, it says, as you read Official Declaration 2, what do you learn about the Lord's process for guiding the policies of his church? And so again, the implication is that this was the Lord guiding this policy. I think that's what it's implying. And I'm very bought in to what you guys are saying, that we do know why. And it was a mistake, a big mistake. And I'm just curious, maybe for both of you, and maybe Ramesus, you could go first, but just like I'm curious about the shape that your faith takes when you can at once trust in God, be a member of this church, and accept a reality in which the men that we sustain as prophets are making mistakes that have generational impacts for certain marginalized people.
So that's not to be like the normal panels. That's a great question. But I'm listening to, I'm like, that is actually a really good question. It's a great question. When I found out that Black people could hold the priesthood, it shook me, which is really interesting because I wasn't active, but I had a testimony. I just wasn't living the gospel. But I had a personal revelation that laid it all out to me, and it gave me clarity. I won't say it was like Nephi's revelation or vision about the tree of life that his father had, but it was in depth enough that I, with the testimony and the faith that I had, I could accept it. And one of the things that I learned from that experience was it's all about free agency. I think we throw free agency around like, oh, the gospel's predicated on free agency, and I've got free agency to do whatever I want to. And I got to teach my kids, you do, but you don't have free agency when it comes to consequences. And I think that's that aspect that we forget. The consequences of free agency is, how does your free agency impact someone else? For me, I believe that it's my free agency to believe. And so people have asked me that. They're like, well, how do you stay? I'm like, because I've had experiences in my life that solidify that the gospel is true. And when it's all said and done, I'm not going to turn my back on the gospel because I know it's true. And that's what I look at those Black pioneers. They knew the gospel was true. They were not willing to relinquish what they were given and to hold on to it. And I think sometimes in modern day, so many things in our world happen. You find out that Black people can have the priesthood. And I know that's an injustice. And when I say these things, I'm not saying them to be dismissive or that they don't matter. I know people have problems with, with polygamy or with the queer community and some of the decisions that the church has made. I understand and I empathize. But then I go back to, it is our free agency that keeps us grounded and rooted in the gospel. It does not mean that I don't understand. And I think sometimes we get wrapped up into, when we say the church, where we want to combine the church and the gospel, but the gospel is the truth. In the gospel truth, or the truths that we learn through the gospel, will always be the same. In a training I'm working on, I came across this article in the Young Adult Weekly by Drew Pearson. And he says this: expressing racism, nationalism, or any other prejudice or discrimination is not loving one another. Christ is truly no respecter of persons, and all are alike unto God. We can show it by proactively reaching out in love to everyone, regardless of whether they're in our usual circles or not. And I think that's where, if the church comes out and says, I'm sorry, and acknowledges what has happened, it allows that wall to come crumbling down, i.e. the Berlin Wall. Now we don't have the hardness, the scales fall off our eyes, off our heart, however you want to coin it. And it allows people to start seeing each other the way we should see each other. But I think we get so wrapped up into the natural man that we forget that, like you said earlier, Tim, prophets are fallible because they're a man first who's been given the opportunity to serve everyone and not just themselves. And it's not trying to make excuses for people. My brother and I, our biological father died when I was 18. And up to that point, I'd only saw him twice, when I was 8, when I was 10. And the next time I saw him, I was 18 and he was in a coffin. And he didn't have any relationship with us. And so that was heavy. Like, I have a letter. I think it's like 4 or 5 pages long, that one night I woke up just crying, which is unusual because I don't cry. But I was just just overwhelmed, and I was writing this letter, and I was thinking if I write it out how I'm feeling, maybe that'll make me feel better. And I called my mom in hysterics, and she talked to me, and all the things I was trying to do to feel better, nothing ever worked. Nothing. I mean, I don't care how I prayed, go do this, do that, nothing worked. And so the thing about Ramses and the spirit is that I'm going to argue with the spirit. I'm, I'm getting better when the spirit says, go and do this. Now I'm better about just going and do, but before the spirit was like, you need to take him and go do a simple work. And I'm like, I'm not doing that. And for a few weeks, I'm like, I'm not doing that. And so obviously the spirit won. And the way the spirit convinced me was because the thing I've been holding on to was when I see you in the next life, I want to ask you all the questions, the whys. And the spirit was like, so if you could sit and talk with him now, whatever his rationale for why he did and behaved the way he did, would that be good enough for you? And I was like, honestly, no. There's nothing he can say that will be good enough to erase that pain in the void that was left. The spirit was like, so if you know that to be true, you need to let it go. You can go do his temple work so that you give him an opportunity that the Lord wants us to give to everyone who's never had the gospel. Your responsibility is not to judge him, but to allow him the opportunity to hear the gospel, to accept the gospel. He doesn't, that's on him. But you can say that you've done everything you're supposed to do. And, honestly, I was upset about that answer because I knew the spirit was right. So I did a simple work and I felt that he accepted it. But the piece that came from it was that I did my part. And when I hold this dinner reconciliation, one of the things I started with, yes, the conversation is race reconciliation. But then I back it up and I take the race away. And I'm like, what is it in your life that you can pinpoint right now at this moment that you have not reconciled, whether it's with a person, whether it's with the gospel, it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't have to be with people. It could be with anything. It could be something that from your childhood. What is it in your life that you feel holds you back?
Mm.
Because until you can reconcile within yourself and make yourself whole, how can you go about trying to make yourself whole with others? And so for me, once I was able to reconcile the pain that I carried, and when I say I carried, I mean I carried. That's what the atonement is there for. I think we oftentimes like to think about, oh, it's for when we're sick or if we're hurt. But there's other things that happen to us that creates greater pain within us than a physical situation or of us sinning. I mean, that's it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's beautiful.
All your turn.
I would love to hear what you think about reconciliation and repentance and how we do this together.
Yeah, well, I love what Ramesus said. And I let me say, I completely agree. You have to learn to love yourself, right? And then you are prepared to reach out and love your neighbor as yourself. That implies that you have come to a place of love for yourself. And, for me, that's been a struggle, right? But that then puts you in a powerful position to love and reconcile in other ways and can be beautiful. So for me, how I grapple with this, I think we do ourselves and our leaders a disservice when we put them on such a high pedestal that no one can live up to. They're so far out of reach. They're simply beyond human. And I think it's okay to let prophets be human and grounded in agency. There's a chapter in the Deseret Book, let's talk about race and priesthood, where that's based on agency, right? We say agency is so important in the gospel plan. God's not going to violate it, even to allow Hitler to murder 6 million Jews. And yet we assume that God will come down and stop Brigham Young from saying the terrible things he said about race in 1852. A prophet has agency. God does not revoke even a prophet's agency. And this is where my profession and my faith kind of intermingle. But as a historian, I'm used to messy history. That's what I expect. You give human beings agency, things will get messy really quickly. And I don't expect things to get tidy all of a sudden when I turn from, U.S. history towards Latter-day Saint history. I'm expecting the same messiness because we're talking about human beings. I love Moroni's advice in Mormon 9:31. He articulates that he and his father, both prophets, have imperfections. And he says, please don't condemn us because of our imperfections, but rather learn to do better because you have understood our perfections. And that's what our call is, I think, in the 21st century, is to learn from the imperfections of the past on race in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and learn to do better. We've been called to do so. We've been called to root out racism and called to lead out in abandoning attitudes and actions of prejudice. What better people to lead out if we are willing to actually own our own history, not deny or defend it, but actually own it. Say, okay, we've learned the consequences of racism because we participated in it. We've learned how it feels to be racialized because that happened to us in the 19th century. What better people then to pivot and lead out in abandoning attitudes and actions of prejudice because we understand the consequences of racism. That's how I think we can own this history and turn it into a positive because we have learned from the mistakes of the past. So that's kind of how I view it and come to terms with it. I find it so much easier to walk alongside fallible people because of my own fallibility. And I am just so profoundly reliant upon Christ's grace that I am willing to also try to extend that grace to others, even those in the past. And the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has this profound theology of eternal progression that is really quite unique in the Christian spectrum of things. I love it. I think it's just phenomenal. Meaning we get to continue to progress. We're not sort of stuck in hellfire for eternity. And do we really imagine Brigham Young in some corner of the eternity stuck on his position from 1852? I firmly believe he has repented and he wants us to as well. He wants us to progress. Like sometimes I see people circling the wagons and trying to defend what he said. I think he wants us to repent and move forward. For heaven's sake, if we believe in eternal progression, then Brigham Young is at the forefront of leading us forward on this issue. So let's join him in moving forward. But we can't do it by ignoring what has happened. We have to confess and repent, and then we can move forward. Like pretending like, okay, that's all behind us. We don't know what happened. That's not the way I was taught repentance in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We have to model the very principles we're taught.
So I know we've got to wrap up here, but I wonder if just in terms of, brief closing thoughts, if we think about, President Nelson's call, which I think, was truly prophetic, if somebody's wondering how they can take a step forward from your perspectives, I'm curious what you'd recommend.
I believe where it begins is with empathy. I think one of the things that we lack in society is empathy. That empathy is weak. It's unbecoming. I'm not asking you to get into my shoes and walk a mile with me. But part of our baptismal covenants, part of the things that at the waters of Mormon that Alma reminded them is that you're going to mourn with me. You're going to be there with me in my darkest moment. And I remember doing a fireside and someone asked me, well, how can we be there for our Black brothers and sisters? And I use the example of when you watch television and you see a Black person being killed by a police officer. Forget why it happened or what's going on, just the moment. I was like, look at it like this: how the church rallies around members in the ward when someone passes. I don't know your mom, but I asked, hey, can I come bring you a meal? Can I come do this? Can I do that? Can I do that? I was like, now flip it. I was like, and let me share with you what a Black person, especially a guy, and then a mom or sister is thinking. The first thing that we do, depending on where it is, like if there's a shooting in the Dallas-Fort Worth area where I grew up, I'm waiting patiently, anxiously to hear the name. And so I'm going through, when they say the name, I'm going through all the people that I know. I'm checking with all of my friends. Hey, are you guys safe? I was like, what you can do is just ask them, hey, are you okay? Can I come just sit with you and listen to how you're feeling? This is a situation where I think if we dive into empathy and are willing to just sit and listen to how they feel, will make the difference. You alluded to how Paul would teach in that recording. One of the things I talked about was, as a church that's built fundamentally on forever families, growing through the eternities, the thing that always gets forgotten about is what happened to the forever families for Black members, those enslaved members who joined the church, or the Black members who joined the church knowing that they could not go to the temple and have the priesthood. It is possible that so many of them could be in church leadership right now, because we think about church leadership as a generational wealth type model, not that there's nepotism or anything. It's just kind of how it's worked out. You know, we were trying to, earlier this year, we were trying to find a descendant, trying to see if we could link a descendant of Green Flake. And my mind reverted back to, what if Green Flake was allowed to be sealed to his wife? Now all of their children are sealed to them. Maybe instead of them being in different parts of the country and not even maybe knowing who Green Flake is, but they would be members of the church, strong members in the gospel. As the truth comes out and we discuss it honestly, what I'm hoping for is that empathetic feeling of, I didn't ever think about what you lost because you were not allowed to have.
Yeah, so I think for me, here's something that I wish, because I have these conversations and, people are, they recognize we've been called on to help root out racism. But my experience talking, especially with white Latter-day Saints, is that in their minds, that means that racism is something that is out there in society. It's not something that exists amongst us as Latter-day Saints. And it's certainly not something that has to do with the racial, priesthood, and temple restrictions. I mean, literally, I've had, those kind of conversations. So here's how I like to think about it, right? Before 1978, I include Frida Lucretia McGee-Ballou in the chapter on the 1978 Revelation in the Let's Talk About Race and Priesthood book. Because she was baptized in 1909, and within 1 month of the June 1978 Revelation, she's traveled 1,000 miles to be in Washington, D.C. temple to be sealed by proxy to her deceased husband. That's how much it meant to her. And when she gives a talk in state conference in 1982, she calls that the happiest day of her life, and she's 82 years old, and that's her happiest day. But do we recognize, right, that before 1978, Ramesus and I could go into, let's say we have the same bishop, and I will answer the temple recommend questions exactly the same as Ramesus. And I would get to go to the temple and Ramesus wouldn't. Not because of his lack of devotion to God, but because of the color of his skin. What do we call that? What is the name for that? It's called racism. Like, we did that for 130 years, and I continue to encounter Latter-day Saints who do not equate the priesthood and temple restriction with racism. So how do we root it out until we can actually make that equation? Like, that's a classic definition of racism, that we both have the same qualifications. I'm admitted Ramesus is denied, not based on qualifications, based on race. That's racism, for heaven's sake. And I continue to have conversations with people who do not equate the racial priesthood and temple restrictions with racism. So that's where I would like to start, is having that conversation and grappling with the notion of what is the definition of racism? Does it exist amongst us as Latter-day Saints, instead of people's minds automatically going to something out there in society that needs to be addressed, right? People calling other people the N-word or whatever else it is that's in their imagination, instead of thinking about our own racial history. I still have encountered people who say, yeah, Black people are cursed descendants of Cain, and we don't have any problem with racism. Like, they do not equate those two things, right? So to me, that's where we have to go. Those are the open and honest conversations that we need to engage in for us to be able to fulfill the call.
Thank you so much. It feels really powerful to hear you both just speaking so openly about what racism is and how we can look at it with clear eyes so that we can actually root it out. Like, how can we root it out? How can we dig it up and excavate and get it out unless we're willing to look at it honestly? So thank you so much for being a part of that work and for helping us in this space too. We're so grateful to you both.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. Great to talk to both of you. Thank you so much.
That's great.
Thanks, guys.
All right, thanks so much for listening. Before we go, we wanted to let you know about a few resources that we hope will be really helpful as you continue exploring this topic. Black Lives Bless has produced a fantastic video featuring Paul and Ramesus and a panel of thoughtful contributors as they walk through how this history might be taught in a Sunday school setting. Paul shares some of the same historical insights that he discusses in this episode, but he's also got a link to some really helpful slides and visuals that you can see there. We've also included links to a few past Faith Matters episodes and additional resources that we hope will support your study of Official Declaration 2 and the broader history surrounding it. You can find everything in the show notes or on our website, faithmatters.org. Again, thanks so much for listening.